Let's turn our attention to somebody you hear by phone every day. We record Sue Martin at about 12:35 or 6 usually. She's on the air at around 12:55. We call her each and every business day of the year. She's from Webster City, Iowa. Sue's been on the air, well, because she's on the air every day, probably more than anybody else in individual shows than anybody on the radio station. So we thank you, Sue Martin, for doing the programs there each and every day. It makes a big difference. I know the audience loves to hear from you. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say today. Please give Sue a nice warm welcome. She does have that piece of paper that just got handed out to you to work from.
And first, Todd, I should just remind you, I know that you forget easy. I forgot my watch today. So when I start talking a little too long, because I don't talk a lot, but when I talk a little too long, just let me know, because I'm never on time anyway. So, you know, I guess the best way to start is to compare last year to this year. You know, last year, analysts were extremely bearish at about this time of the year. And we came into 2013 dealing with the European austerity, causing concern that it would rub off into the US. Then we had Obamacare passed under the guise of fair health care for all Americans, even though Congress didn't have to be in that group. And then we also had continuation of QE stimulus. We had a corn crop that was projected to be one of the largest ever in history. Although we all know the end of that story, it didn't happen. But what's interesting is, last year, the 2013-14, the global corn production grew by 100.1 million metric tons. And the U.S. accounted, and that was an increase, by the way, of 100.1 million metric tons. And the U.S. accounted for 82% of that increase. Now we have China, and of course, China we thought at first, the USDA has them targeted to take 7.5 million metric tons of corn from the U.S. this year. CNGOIC, a think tank in China, had said back in December maybe 4.5 to 5. And we'll see about that, because China was counting on the Ukraine to supply them a fair amount of corn. And while the Ukraine today didn't guarantee, but reinstated that they were going to do everything in their power to make sure that corn gets to China, you know, the Chinese have a very good memory. And they won't forget if something happens that their grain doesn't get to them on time. And the same thing happened in Brazil last year when they did not get their grain loaded out, their soybeans loaded out and to them on time. Within the next 2 to 3 years, China's imports of corn are expected to grow from 7.5 million metric tons this year to 25-30 million metric tons next year, or within the next 2 to 3 years. So demand is going to be really pretty good out of China. Over the next 2 to 3 years, China is expected to increase 36% their aquaculture. And aquaculture takes an awful lot of wheat feeding, takes a lot of soy meal. In the meantime, China is expected to decrease soy plantings this year by 8 to 10, 11%. Their wheat production last year, from 2006 to last year, grew by 46%, and they still increased much of, they were the largest buyer of Australian wheat. China has, from 1961, when per capita meat consumption was 4 kilograms, to 2010, it grew to 61 kilograms per capita. And that appetite is still growing. But it doesn't just stop there. In China, we have noted that the Chinese individual has gotten to be really liking his mobility. And I believe that all this concern about the EPA, which now is rumoring that they're not going to leave the mandate at 10%, that they may let it go to 15. That's a rumor, we'll see. But I think all the concern and all the hoopla about that mandate staying at 10 million or 10% was really more concern of psychology. Because if you think about it, what's a mandate? A mandate is stating you have to do that much, but there's no top side on it. The ceiling is wide open. And we've already seen China come back over the last 3 weeks, taking much of our DDGs. Remember, they canceled 10 to 15,000 metric tons of DDGs, which was a pittance because of contamination of Mir 162, the GMO trait from Syngenta. I think that was nothing but a ploy to break the price, and the price broke about $100 a ton, and they came in and they started buying again. But I think that that appetite for mobility by the Chinese individual is absolutely going to blow the socks off or the doors off of the ethanol industry in the U.S. And I think that demand will cause distillate surplus or distillate supplies to decline as exports go up. In the meantime, if you look at China, right now, China's pork prices are slipping a little bit. The crush is said to have softened a little bit here lately. And the fish industry, their prices are softening a little bit too. And they certainly have had, I think, 36 deaths so far with H7N9 avian bird flu. So that's kind of causing demand a little bit for temporarily setting back. We see this a lot of winters. But I don't think that's going to last long. And the demand for soy meal, I guess as farmers in the U.S. with our soybean markets, we ought to say thank you, Argentina. Argentina's currency, first off, Argentina's economy is moving south this year. They are not expecting any growth at all. Philippines, same thing. The Philippines aren't going to see growth this year, mainly because of the horrendous typhoon that they incurred. However, China this morning came out and stated that they felt that the growth for that country in 2014 would be 7.5%. We think it's probably more like 7%, but the government's not going to state that because they don't want to cause alarm. In the meantime, you look at Thailand, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, and India. And those countries are expected to grow this year by 1.4 to 1.5%. Then you have the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and South Africa all in growth as well. And Brazil is in that camp, along with Mexico and Chile. And Canada, being part of the Western Hemisphere, would be included in that growth pattern as well. Now you look at Russia. And Russia's, of course, been in the news along with the Ukraine. And the Ukraine is very interesting because they have a lot of black dirt. Last year, China bought 7 million acres of Ukrainian soil. And they not only that, they've also given them some pretty good funding. And of course, they're very concerned with what's going on in the Ukraine right now. Overnight, Putin said that they would see no need to actually go into the Ukraine at this time. However, we have to note that the EU prime ministers are all meeting on Thursday because of their concern, and it's thought that they will be talking about sanctions against Russia. But there's reasons that Russia's interested in the Ukraine, and it really, in my opinion, is not because of concern over Russian citizens. It's because there is a gas pipeline, a crude oil pipeline, that goes from Russia through southern Ukraine that feeds Eastern European refineries. He's interested in that pipeline. In the meantime, the Ukraine has minerals, and they have some of the richest land for agriculture and for food production. I think he's after the Ukraine for more than just his people or pro-Russians. Now, the Ukrainians, can they really step back from him? If they fought against Viktor Yanukovych, they're not going to step back from Putin, but they're asking for help. And today, the IMF has people in the Ukraine trying to work a solution for funding. Back in 2011, the IMF turned down the Ukraine for funding because they weren't taking austerity measures enough. And so they're checking out to see what they can do. But I don't think this situation's settled down by any stretch of the imagination. And we tend to look at what we call cycle windows, volatility cycles. And in April, I suspect we're going to see that situation in the Ukraine and Russia really explode. Now, having said that, when I look at the markets here, your first graph is corn production deficit. And I like to look at foreign corn production deficits. It takes the U.S. out of the picture. And it tells us how needy is the rest of the world. Well, first off, if the Ukraine doesn't get corn shipped, most of their wheat, the wheat's reacted to the Ukrainian situation and the concern of winter kill here in the U.S. In the last few days. But what really is interesting is the Ukraine has much of they might have, say, 7 million metric tons of wheat left to ship, but it's their corn campaign that is ready to go. And because of that, I think the corn market has the potential to become more volatile or stronger in value. The Ukraine would be part of this, and of course, with their increase in production that they had this last year, which it's thought production this coming season, planting season, will decline. And then you look at the fact that this has South American production in it as well. The only producing country that's not in this number is the U.S. And if you look at the need by the rest of the world, much greater than a year ago, and of course, even greater than the last 2 years. So that said, demand is very good for corn. Now, there's been some discrepancy about our carryouts, and of course, about feedstocks. That's one area that traders, analysts want to be bearish. And I disagree with them. I think that our feeding of U.S. corn has been phenomenal. Let's take a look at 2012. In 2012, we harvested the U.S. corn crop starting much earlier. We started by the end of July. And there's where some of the discrepancy, that 300 million bushels that could have been commingled with old crop, and the USDA would waffle back and forth, stocks to stocks reports. But bottom line is, we commingled a lot of new crop corn in with old that year. Now let's look at last year. Last year, our harvest was late. We had weather patterns that ran a month late, right in well into the fall. And consequently, our planting season ran about a month late also and coincided, and that is how we got some of those good yields that we did get. Quality, questionable. But the bottom line is, the harvest was so late last year, we didn't commingle a thing. And therefore, because of the late harvest, a lot of corn could have been in transit for export. And because it's not countable at the time they did the December stocks report, that grain probably went into the residual number in with feed. That could be called a little bit higher. But you look at the export pace that we have had this year, and it's been phenomenal. Why? Because all the fears that we had last year And then by the time we got into 2014, what did we have going? U.S. industrial production, the best since 2006. We had the adverse effects or the concerns about Obamacare offset by actually passing the debt or averting the debt crisis. And of course, because the economy appears to be doing better, we are tapering off of stimulus QE. So we've got some changes. We went through one of the longest periods of individuals holding on to cars in history. And now with all this optimism, we are finding that car sales are picking up. And it's another sign of a better economy. Global economies, albeit only 1.4%, are growing. And just recently, at a G20 meeting, or G8 meeting, I mean, we had, word out of there was that they were looking at coming together and globally bringing about the ability to have 10 million more jobs. Think of that, 10 million more jobs. That's more food. People working want more food. That's protein. So when we look at the landscape of demand, and a year ago, all of these analysts could say was sell, sell, sell. And you know what? You had some of your best prices in the summer. And cash basis helped a lot. And I agree with Murray. I think basis this year for corn is going to really hurt a little bit. In Nebraska, I am told that the ethanol plants are pretty filled up into May. And their concern is that the corn out of South Dakota and North Dakota, especially South Dakota, is going to start moving into Nebraska. In those two states, bins are so full of corn, and my understanding is a chunk of that corn in those bins is from 2012-13. There's a lot of corn in that area to move. Basis is going to bite the dust there. And in the meantime, we're also hearing corn that's maybe not holding up very well in condition. And we're seeing that in Minnesota, Iowa, especially Minnesota and the northern half of Iowa. But I'm hearing it also in Indiana and Ohio and Illinois. That's corn that's going to have to move. It went into the bins at 17%. You thought you were drying it down. It's coming out of the bins at 17%. And when it starts to warm up and you get this sun on the south side of those bins will heat up and that corn will move. And trucks are on the road a lot in Minnesota and northern Iowa when it's not snowing. You know, those farmyards are full of snow. But regardless, trucks are moving corn because they have no choice. They got to get it moved. And yet the corn price is held. The funds went long for the first time in 8-10 months on corn, just in this last, albeit only 20,000 contracts, they've gone long. And why wouldn't they? They're coming into the time of the year when weather can play a hand. And why else wouldn't they? Because prices are dirt cheap, and cheap prices creates demand. If you look at the Ukraine, that's graph number 2, and you can see the huge increase in production a year ago. And their ending stocks are record large at 3.6 million metric tons. And their stocks as a percent of usage, look at how aggressively their stocks grew, and yet look at how their stocks as a percent of usage did not grow percentage-wise comparable. It shows that they are using corn themselves faster than they can produce. Now let's look at the Asian tigers. We already know how China sits, but look at the Asian tigers. That is South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand, and Taiwan. And production increased a little bit this last year. Look at the stocks as a percent of usage. It declined. They're using more than they're producing. Or let's put it this way, they're using it faster than they can produce it. I thought it would be interesting. One of the things I do every year is look at like number of years. And I have data that goes all the way back. In corn, it goes back to 1908, and in beans to 1912, I believe. And I went back and looked at every year that ends in a 4. Last August, I was asked to speak for Armtech, a crop insurance company out of Dallas, Texas. And they had, it was a meeting where they had all of their salesmen and crop adjusters in from all over the country. It was kind of interesting because I never ever thought about crop insurance on pecan trees or oranges, but they have it, and those people were all there. And this is when I first looked at a year ending in a 4, and I was amazed. Now, I have the graph also for old crop corn, but I thought, since this is a year that we're really focusing on new crop contracts, I thought it'd be interesting to see what does a year ending in a 4 look like. And you can see there were 2 years ending in a 4 out of the 10 that did not make higher highs. The ones in green made higher highs than the year before for the contracts. And this is based on old crops, so July, August. And then when we get to beans, it'll be November beans, January beans, because we're trying to do the year. But the one thing I wanted this chart to do, if there's any thought that I can leave with you today, it's to inspire you as to when to pull that trigger. Not to say prices are going here, going there, but when will the best time be for your prices? And if you look back at history, history tends to repeat itself, and it gives us a good idea of when we should take a look. Now, that doesn't just stop there. We have other things we have to look at, fundamentals, technicals, to see what the story is for that individual year. But if you look at history, well, you never did make a high in January, February, or March for new crop corn. The highs at the very earliest in 2004, 1 year, came in the month of April. And if it was early April or late April, the bar goes straight through the whole month. And then the next month is June. June's pretty predominant, and of course July and August is pretty dominant as well into September. Now, it's interesting, 1934 was December. And what's interesting is this year does have a lot of parallels. I should say 2012 paralleled to 1934. And then 2013 paralleled a lot to 1935. This year is very parallel to 1936 when you come to weather. And that year, in 1935-36 winter, you had California a little dry, and starting in about February, it started to rain in Northern California. But the drought in California wasn't infamous that year. The year of 1918-1919, very parallel to this year. Bitterly cold winter, an extreme dry California, started to catch some rains in the month of February. What was really interesting about that year is the fact that it was also going into an El Nino. And they think we're going into an El Nino now. So it's going to be real interesting. You have a lot of snowpack in the Rockies. And I think all of us probably forgot about the flooding in Colorado last fall. That flooding filled the River Platte, or the Platte River Valley aquifer and reservoir. Now, where's all that snowmelt going to go out of the Rockies? But the good story is, for those farmers in eastern Colorado and in Nebraska on down into Kansas, where they count on that aquifer for irrigation, they're going to be blessed this year. In the meantime, If you look at the southeast is looking at turning possibly drier this year. And that dryness moves up towards the north and west. So what's going to be kind of interesting is, and something we really need to watch, is this could be one of those years where the drought hits the worst east of the Mississippi. And that's you guys. We have a big ice depth in the Great Lakes, and a lot of snow to melt off. And it could be a cool, wet spring, one that takes a little longer to get your crops in. They become shallow-rooted, and then you get hit with the heat. So we need to really watch this year, because this year carries that chance. This year also has some similarities to 1988 as well. I remember 1988 was the first time I had ever seen spider mites. And I can remember I lived 25 miles from my office. I would drive to work in the morning. Fields looked like one thing. I'd drive home in the afternoon, and I could swear they were changing color. Well, our yields were 8 bushel to the acre on beans. So it's going to be kind of interesting. Now, as far as acres go this year, I believe, first off, we had 3.3 million acres come out of CRP last September. And pretty much all those acres, they were in CRP for a reason. Pretty much those acres are going to either be wheat or soybeans. And that's probably where a chunk of these bean acres is going to come from. Then you had 6 to 7 million acres prevent plant last year. That's going to come back into production. And some of that, a chunk of that, was in good farmable land, some of your best land. 1.6 million acres of those, we estimate, will go back to pasture land, probably in Nebraska and the Dakotas. And then the rest of it will probably make its choice whether it's going to be beans or corn. I think corn acres are going to start off around 91.8 million acres. And depending on what kind of spring we have, if the forecasts are wrong and we come off with a much warmer, drier spring, then I suspect we'll see more corn acres in that final plantings report at the end of June. But I'm hearing an awful lot from seed salesmen of more bean acres appearing, seed beans being sold in Illinois and Iowa. So it does look like we're seeing a shift. I know that rootworm, year in, year out, continuous corn, yields haven't been as good. There's a drag on it. And rootworm is starting to catch hold in Iowa. On our farm, we had one field that has been corn on corn for years. And the last year, that field looked horrendous, and the yield was no better than the yield on our beans, 43 bushels to the acre. So I suspect the guy that rents our land is probably going to make a switch. But that said, if we look at bean acres, I'm looking for bean acres to be 81.7 to 81.8 million acres. And we'll see what Mother Nature does. A cool, wet spring, we may pick up on those acres. I don't normally give a chart, but because instead of doing a PowerPoint on a screen where you can't see them and you have a handout, I decided to give you a chart. This graph is a monthly corn chart, and it's based on year in, year out July corn. And if you notice the circles, I do them for one reason. The circles above the line, which happens to be a 40-month moving average. The circles above the line just is there to draw your attention on how you get so far away from that 40-month moving average, you snap back. But here's what I wanted you to see. If you look at underneath a 40-month moving average, and I could fast forward this chart all the way back to 1968, and it would make no difference. It would look the same. Notice how prices never get too far away from a 40-month moving average underneath. Now look at how extreme prices are currently for the July corn. It's too far away, and yeah, corn prices can seesaw here for a month or so, but what this shows is I believe markets are going to make a rally to come back and draw closer, snap back closer to the 40-month moving average. That 40-month moving average, 638. Come on, you can laugh. You can. Now, the other indicator, the indicator at the bottom, that indicator is an indicator I use a lot. It's called TRIX. And what it means is it's triple exponential moving average. And there's different combinations you can put together. And the reason I don't have the numbers on here is just simply because in order to get the whole graph into our printing, I had to be able to just move it. I wanted to keep it big enough so we could get the effect of what the indicators were doing. The bottom line is the TRIX at the end of November, early December, this indicator will lead, and it tends to tip you off early. But this indicator turned at the end of November into early December, and it was record low. This indicator had never been as low as it was at that time in history. Is that a time you get bearish and sell markets? No. You think about it, you try to catch your breath, and you say, there's something better coming. I've got to wait. But you don't sell at times like that. This indicator is a very clean indicator. It's not one that chops around a lot. Now, granted, prices can kill some time while this forms. But the indicator's already turned up, and it's telling you values aren't going to go much lower. If they come back down, they're only going to be testing some levels. You probably have seen your lows on July corn. On soybeans, you know, one thing I went back because I remember the old days. I've been in the business 42 years, as much as I hate to admit that. But I went back because I remember hearing somewhere back in time that there was a little history on years when you take November bean price, or not November's, it could be March beans. Corn does it too. But when you take bean prices and you make higher highs in February from a harvest low, it sets a pattern or a tone. I went back and looked at that since 1968. Would you believe 100% of the time, both July and November beans make higher highs after February? Now, you know, it's going to be interesting because the highs of the contracts for July was last Thursday. It's not saying we can't have some seesawing here. We can't. But it's telling you the odds are favoring something better in price. When you look at supplies, all the bears can talk about is just that, supplies on soybeans. The world's in a glut. Well, we priced in 90 million metric tons to 93 million metric tons South American production. Ag Rural, Fernando, is a good friend of mine. And he'd been telling me, he'd been traveling the country, and he said, Sue, we've got a problem. He said, for one thing, he said, we've been running from, I think he said in January, they ran 3 weeks straight, every afternoon, 100 to 105 degrees. He said, our crop has a problem, and it's not where we were. And they had originally been up to around 89. I think they were 88.8 or something like that at the time, maybe 89. They are now at 87. Recently, he told me that they're probably going to lower down again to 86. Saffrocine mercados dropped sharply here this week. in their estimate, and they're currently down around 86.2 million metric tons on beans. We're changing the psychology for now. Now you look at foreign soybean production deficit. And keep in mind, this number's as of February 10th. It has Brazilian, Argentinian production in it. And while the USDA probably won't lower their number very quickly, in all likelihood, that number, because of big production down there anticipated, it showed less need in the world than a year ago. I think that's changing. And you look at the need by China, and there's rumors today that China is requesting out of Brazil to delay shipments of April and May to June and July for soybeans. We haven't seen only but one go-around of reductions or cancellations. I suspect we won't. I suspect that the next go-around of cancellations will be like last year, maybe in April. But I suspect China's going to take most everything they can get a hold of because they want to be assured. The problem I see is the U.S. farmer hanging on, especially in corn. The Argentine farmer is hanging on, and because of the dollar-peso currency exchange, in the black market is running at 65.6%. That indicates probably a bigger percentage of inflation, rate of inflation in that country than what they're saying. And it's a concern in Argentina because they have $31 billion in their central bank reserves. $31 billion is next to nothing in the form of central banking. Farmers aren't selling their old crop beans unless they have to go buy something. And then they take a bag of beans with them, and that's how they pay for things. So because Argentina is the world's largest exporter of soy meal and soy oil, and if they can't get the beans to crush, they're running about 60% of capacity, the U.S. has garnered that business. And that's created a good demand and has helped our prices come back up. But this talk about huge production in South America. Now keep in mind, the next graph, Western Hemisphere, March 1st total supply stocks, is vented off of the February 10th report. Okay, think about this. That report showed, 93 million metric tons, well, guesses are, and the USDA was at 90 in Brazil. Well, the bars, and some of your graphs might be a little different, but the bars in some of them will be yellow. The off-colored bars, those are years, and I took this, if I could have slid this chart backwards, it would have went all the way back to 1976. The years that are in off-color or brighter are bars where we had U.S., Brazilian, and Argentine South American production combined. Our stocks on March 1st increased by 4.8 to 5 million metric tons from the year before. Now, wouldn't that be a bearish thing? I took those years and I looked at new crop beans to see what they did. There were 14 of them. 11 of the 14 made higher highs than the year before. And the other 3 tended to almost equal their highs. Let's put it this way. They gave you a chance for a much better opportunity than what you're looking at today. Now, the last graph is, and I apologize, mine's all in gray. Yours might be green, but whatever that last graph is in color, notice all the bars are the same color. This is going on the assumption that years ending in a 4, while old crop beans can have, I think there was 3 or 4 of the years. There were 1964, 74, 84, and 94 for old crop beans that did not make higher highs than the year before for the contract. In new crop beans, every one of them made higher highs. The contract high on November beans is $13.39, I believe. I think you've got something better coming. But what I wanted to show you on this graph is, when's your window? When do you make your sales? Now, we tend to also get to where we try to pick that time and pin them down to dates within the windows. But here's the deal. Only one time did you, out of the 10 years, did you put a high in the month of March, which happened to be 2004. All the others, at a minimum, June, maybe one time in May, June, otherwise it tended to be more July, August, September, and 3 years you went all the way into a January contract, putting the high end for the year in December. Again, your window of selling your new crop grain is not now. What I would suggest, and I noticed the other analysts making recommendations, puts. If you want to floor yourself and protect yourself in your prices, I agree with them. I think puts is the best way to go, but don't sell calls. Sell out of the money puts. And if you have to, walk your market down. But I would not sell calls because you want to leave that top side open. What if we have a weather market this year? What if? And the Eastern Corn Belt, let me tell you, if you guys have a drought, markets seem to respond a whole lot better than when we have a drought. If we're west of the Mississippi, we don't count near like you guys do. So just keep your eyes open and just know, in my opinion, you have something much better yet to come. Near-term resistance, 1222, 1232. I wouldn't be surprised if you see $13 beans, new crop beans. On the downside, because it is potential that you move up and then in the latter part of the year come down. The downside, no worse than 989. 989, 985, right in there is a wave 5. And we did see a wave 5 for the first time in December corn this last year, and that was 408. So I tend to be a little bit price positive, both in corn and beans. As far as corn, if December corn goes under 4 with a 3 in front of it, I'll bet it don't go any further than 385. And I wouldn't be surprised if it holds. I think corn's going over $5. Do I have any questions?
You do now. All right, a couple of quick questions. Anybody got a question for her? Yeah.
How long before we see this screen? Will it be, if you go by different months and then there's a spread, when do we kind of know it's getting close to the high?
Well, what I would
When do you know when the high, getting close to the high?
Okay. Subscribe to Futures Cash Info. No, I'm just kidding.
.com?
Yeah, .com.
Yep, thank you.
But basically, if you look at those graphs, just start knowing where the thickness of the graph tends to be, and then start watching what's happening in the market, what's going on. And there's a lot of analysts that do dates, that do times, that throw out times where the market's going to have a high here, low here, whatever. But that's, I would say to you, is probably a good way. WIL has a lot of analysts on their station, and they all talk, you know, everybody kind of focuses on times. Price levels, watch your price levels. One good way to know is watch the heat. Listen to what the people are saying and how enthusiastic they are and how bullish they are. Usually that's a sign you want to go the other direction.
All right. Give Sue a nice round of applause. Thank you so much, Sue.